The Anglican Communion has finally split. It's tragic, and it was probably inevitable. But why did it happen, and what does it mean for the future of Anglicanism? I'm Mike Bird. I'm an ordained Anglican priest and Anglican theologian. Now, I'm not here representing any Anglican body, but some seismic events have taken place in world Anglicanism, and I think we've got to do a bit of a breakdown to understand what has happened, why it happened, and what it means for the future of Anglicanism. Well, if you haven't heard the news, a recent statement has been made by GAFCON, the Global Anglican Future Conference. It declared a reordering of the Anglican Communion. Now, GAFCON is a movement of conservative Anglican churches that formed in 2008 in response to theological disputes within the worldwide Anglican Communion, largely pertaining to discussions about sexuality and attitudes towards biblical authority. GAFCON represents the majority of the world's Anglicans. They have a membership that exceeds 85 million Anglicans across more than 50 countries. And this movement is particularly strong in Africa, Asia, and South America. And what you've got to understand is GAFCON is not breaking away from the Anglican Church. No, they are declaring that they and they alone are the Anglican Church. I mean, listen to the statement that was put out. They said, "As has been the case from the very beginning, we have not left the Anglican Communion. We are the Anglican Communion." That is a strong assertion indeed. I mean, let me explain what this is. This is more than a denominational tiff. It's more than a breakdown of relationships. It's not even a split. It's kind of like a usurpation or a revolution within Anglicanism. It's almost like a coup d'etat. In other words, the Anglican Church, the Church of the Angles, has ejected its English mother from the global Anglican Communion. I mean, to give you an analogy, this is like the Serbian Orthodox churches around the world ejecting Serbia from the Serbian Orthodox network of Serbian churches. Or it's like Southern Baptist churches in Canada declaring that any Southern Baptist who lives south of the Mason-Dixon line is no longer a Southern Baptist, and the Southern Baptist headquarters in Nashville will be relocating to Montreal. It's historical, it's hard to get your head around, and it's wowingly weird in a sense. The GAFCON statement raises interesting questions about what it means to be Anglican and how you tell if someone is Anglican. I mean, what is the sine qua non of Anglicanism? What is the without which not you cannot be Anglican? That is indeed the question. Now, GAFCON has shifted from being a renewal movement in the Anglican Communion. It's shifted from being a type of shadow government within the Anglican Communion to claiming that it is the true and authentic body of the Anglican Communion. Now, that is a de facto claim. GAFCON is claiming they are in reality the Anglican Communion, but it could be just as well a de jure claim, an in-law claim that they are legally the Anglican Communion around the world. Is that true? Well, it depends on how you define Anglicanism, doesn't it? If being Anglican means to be in communion with the See of Canterbury, then no, they are not. They've broken off communion with the See of Canterbury, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, particularly the incoming one. So if you define Anglicanism by an in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, then you would say, no, GAFCON is not an Anglican entity. But if Anglicanism is determined by where you find the most Anglicans, and most of the Anglicans are in the global south part of GAFCON, then they are the true and authentic Anglican body of worldwide Anglicanism. So it comes down to whether you define Anglicanism as a relationship to the See of Canterbury or simply a numbers game of where you find the most people claiming to be Anglican. Now, I wrote this script, and as I was writing this, I had to stop because I suddenly had an epiphany, a moment of realization. I now have to ask the question, in light of the GAFCON statement about the reordering of the communion, I've got to ask a question of myself: am I still Anglican? Because according to GAFCON, you cannot be Anglican and be in communion with the See of Canterbury. But I'm an ordained priest within the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, which is part of the Anglican Province of Australia, which is in communion with the See of Canterbury. So, based on the GAFCON redefinition or reordering of Anglicanism, that would mean no, I'm not Anglican. Maybe, maybe not. Or I just don't know. Again, it depends on who's asking and how you define Anglicanism. What seems to have precipitated this recent statement by GAFCON, or the straw that broke the camel's back, was the appointment of Bishop Sarah Mullaly as the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Sarah Mullaly is currently the Bishop of London, and she is the Archbishop-elect of Canterbury, and she will be the nominal head or leader of the worldwide Anglican Communion, if you define Anglicanism as being in communion with the See of Canterbury. Now, when Bishop Sarah's appointment was announced, the response from GAFCON was fairly negative and I think quite adversarial. They certainly rejected her for a bunch of reasons, not least including her stance on sexuality and her generally progressive views. I thought there was a much better response from an organization called EFAC, the Evangelical Fellowship of Anglican Clergy, which pointed to the fissures and grievances within the global Anglican communion, some of the things that evangelicals are not happy about, but it had a far more collegial and Catholic spirit, and it welcomed Bishop Sarah to her role as Archbishop and hoped that she would be a force for unity and the promotion of the gospel. I thought the EFAC response to Bishop Sarah's appointment was better than the GAFCON one. Now, here's the point of concern for me. Even though GAFCON includes provinces that ordain women to various holy orders, I think the appointment of a woman as the Archbishop of Canterbury, becoming effectively first among equals amongst the bishops of the communion, that was probably too much for some GAFCON provinces to accept. Notwithstanding Bishop Sarah's progressive views of sexuality and marriage, that was cause for concern. I do think it was the fact that she's a woman was the decisive factor. And I say that because other archbishops, particularly Rowan Williams and to a degree Justin Welby, he seemed to have moved to a more progressive view on sexuality. They held similar views to Bishop Sarah, but nobody broke with them. So I do think it was the election of a female archbishop to the See of Canterbury that was the casus belli of this conflict. But you've also got to note that for Bishop Sarah, when she becomes Archbishop Sarah, she will now be the centerpiece of a much smaller international Anglican coalition. And this goes to show that the Anglicans in her orbit, in her communion, in relationship to her, will be mostly Western and mostly white. Yeah, there will be some Africans, particularly from South Africa, maybe some people from India and Oceania, but it is a shrinking network of Episcopal colleges, and she will be the first among equals among a much smaller and a much whiter Anglican communion. How did this happen? Well, it's not simply a reaction to the nomination of Bishop Sarah Mullaly to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. That may be the presenting issue right now, but there is a long backstory on this that goes back at least 30 years. Since the late 1990s, it's been clear that the global South and Western Anglican provinces have very different views on sexuality, family, marriage, and also, I would say, different attitudes towards the authority of Holy Scripture. At a Lambeth conference in 1998, and the Lambeth conferences are like a once in 10-year meeting of Anglican bishops. At this Lambeth conference in 1998, the Communion adopted Lambeth Resolution 110, which explicitly rejects homoerotic practices. Now, it's got a lot of qualifications, there's a lot of unpacking, but generally, it was a statement that says marriage should be between a man and a woman to the exclusion of all relationships. Most Western provinces refused to uphold it, and they refused to enforce it. And it came to an even greater climax in 2003 when the Episcopal Church in America, the main Anglican body there, consecrated an openly gay and non-celibate man, Gene Robinson, as the Bishop of New Hampshire. And despite the American Anglican primate, Frank Griswold, telling the African primates that he would not ordain him, he then went ahead and ordained him. And this heightened a whole bunch of concerns, and it really did fracture relationships within the Anglican communion. Many were concerned that the communion was departing from biblical norms on sexuality, treating biblical authority with contempt, and also that the Americans and the Western bishops were generally duplicitous, and you just could not trust them. They would say one thing but do another. Now, while all this is going on, things got even worse. There's a number of things that start happening that really do harden the divides between the global south and the Western provinces. Western provinces begin ordaining more and more openly gay clergy and blessing same-sex relationships and same-sex marriages, much to the consternation of the global south. And you then get bishops in one province saying they refuse to meet with bishops in another province. And this is happening at conferences and meetings. So there becomes a sort of unofficial division at this point. Look, many Western bishops as well were duplicitous. They would get together with bishops from Africa and Asia, and they would be very accommodating. They would try to assuage their concerns, but once they got back to their home provinces, it was just business as usual. Another thing that happened, and I think this is quite sinister, is that many people in Western Anglican provinces began pushing a narrative whereby African Anglicans in particular were naive and primitive, and they had been brainwashed by reading too many American evangelical websites. So they had adopted an American fundamentalist view on sexuality and marriage. Now, that is not true. The African Anglicans have simply maintained the view of Christian sexuality that, well, generally speaking, Christians have maintained for the last 2,000 years. It's the progressives who have introduced the more innovations on these matters. Now, whether you agree with them or not, I think you have to say this is a bit of an innovation or evolution within Christian views of what it means to be human and sexuality. And even worse, some have even claimed that American conservatives, big wealthy churches, effectively purchased the support of African Anglicans. So there's been a narrative saying that Africans are essentially backwards, they're primitive, or they've been bribed to become like American fundamentalists in their understanding of sexuality. And what the Africans need is another white boss to come explain to them the proper ways to be Anglican or how to interpret the Bible in a progressive sense. And yeah, you even get some Anglican theologians even saying, look, we have to take a more colonial approach to Africa on these matters. So there is a kind of neo-colonialism and a little bit of racism in some Anglican provinces in their attitudes towards Africa. Now, I know people will dispute that, people will protest, but I've got the receipts. I've read the articles, I've heard the sermons, I've listened to the talks. I've heard people say this about Christians in Africa. So there is a kind of neo-colonial and racist bend towards the churches in Africa. The other thing you've got to note is at the beginning of these divisions, when Archbishop Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury, there were a lot of attempts to bring people together and to come up with a resolution. So there was a thing called the Windsor Report. There was a proposal for a thing called a Anglican Covenant. Now, this would be a covenant that everyone would sign up to, and it would be a kind of consensual understanding of what it means to be Anglican, and it would be a kind of code of conduct for Anglican provinces. But the Anglican covenant pretty much died on arrival. It was dead on arrival. It was rejected by the Church of England. Poor Rowan Williams was ambushed in his own synod. His own instrument for healing the divisions within the communion were defeated right there. So it never really got on the ground. And the fact of the matter is, the progressive Western provinces were never going to legislate a stick that was going to be used to drive them out of global Anglicanism. So even the best effort of Rowan Williams to try create an instrument to create accountability and unity within the Anglican communion, that failed from the outset. At the same time as this is all going on, in the early noughties of the 21st century, many conservative dioceses and parishes leave the Episcopal Church, and despite some sort of fragmentation and fracturing amongst those conservatives, they generally come together and gravitate around the Anglican Communion in North America, known as ACNA. Now, here's what you've got to remember, and this kind of demonstrates the issue in the global Anglican Communion. ACNA is formed of people formerly in the Episcopal Church and its disaffected Anglican conservatives. Now, although they have their own primate, they have their own dioceses and bishops and churches, and they're growing at a remarkable rate, they are not technically part of the global Anglican Communion because they're not in communion with the See of Canterbury. But they are in communion with GAFCON. So ACNA is not formally recognized by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but they are recognized by GAFCON. So this is what I mean. You've got two definitions going on as to what constitutes Anglicanism, because you've got two Anglican bodies in the USA, each claiming to represent Anglicanism with different bases of legitimacy. One based on being in communion with Canterbury, and another one based on the fact that they are aligned with the majority of the world's Anglican population. Okay, that is one of the core issues. That's kind of symbolic of the division that's going on. During the tenure of Archbishop Justin Welby, who served from 2012 to 25, despite being from the evangelical wing of the Church of England, he didn't do a lot to repair the broken communion between the provinces. In fact, Welby's, I don't know if you want to call it a defection, conversion, or evolution to a more progressive view of sexuality that served to increase distrust about himself and the office of Archbishop of Canterbury. So that kind of leads us up to the present moment, and the appointment of Bishop Sarah Mullaly to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury has kind of brought this all to the surface and to a point of resolution and now division, where GAFCON now claims they are not in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they are a separate Anglican body that represents the world's Anglicans. Now, I don't want to go around blaming people of it, but I do think I know who we should blame. I think we should blame the two previous Archbishops of Canterbury, Archbishops Rowan Williams and Archbishop Justin Welby. Now, they both have some very good redeeming features of their leadership. Rowan Williams is a very thoughtful theologian. Rowan Williams generally did make an effort to find a way to hold the communion together. Similarly, Justin Welby did not deliberately set out to grieve anyone. And look, and we can talk about the various reasons for his departure and his resignation. But both of them failed to solve the divisions within the Anglican communion, okay? And there was a relatively easy and simple and effective way of healing the fractures within the communion. Everybody knew what they had to do, but they refused to do it. All they had to do was bring together all the bishops of the global Anglican Communion, create in effect an international Anglican synod, then pray together, give speeches, have Bible studies, engage in debates, make motions, and then vote as a collective body on effectively two things. First, do we uphold Lambeth Resolution 110? Is that the communion's view of what the Bible teaches about sexuality? Yes or no? And then secondly, do we expel provinces who refuse to uphold Lambeth Resolution 110? Yes or no? And that would be it. That's all that had to be done. The schism could have been avoided by a robust demonstration of Anglican synodality at a global level. But instead of doing that, Archbishops Williams and Welby refused to let any Anglican body, even the Lambeth Conference, vote on anything that one part of the Anglican Communion might not like the results of. Accordingly, there have been endless meetings, a plethora of communiques that were word salads, and nobody was allowed to decide anything with any effect. As a result, for the past, I think, 30 years, the Anglican Communion has been living in an endless divorce court, where the jury is never allowed to meet to deliberate and deliver a verdict. Instead, the judge, the Archbishop of Canterbury, simply insists on hearing more evidence and more testimony, and it never ended. Now, that process has continued ad nauseum, and now the Global South bishops have had enough. They did not vote to leave. They simply announced that they are taking over. And this, I think, really goes back to a very famous statement by the then Anglican primate of Nigeria, Archbishop Peter Akinola, who famously said, "We don't need Canterbury to get to Jesus." I think that is indeed the motto, the mantra of GAFCON. They don't need Canterbury to get to Jesus. But what does this mean for the future of Anglicanism? Well, according to the GAFCON declaration that's just been made, there are now three things that define Anglicanism. First of all, and this is like, point 5 in their declaration, Anglican provinces will not engage in meetings with the Archbishop of Canterbury, nor will they go to meetings of the Anglican Consultative Council, nor offer monies to it. So basically, to be Anglican means to cut off relations with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Anglican Consultative Council. Also, provinces which have not done so already are called to remove any reference to being in communion with the See of Canterbury from their constitutions. And it also means to affirm the Jerusalem Declaration. That was like a doctrinal statement delivered at a gathering of the GAFCON bishops in Jerusalem in 2008. Now, what that means is to be Anglican is to refuse to have fellowship with the Archbishop of Canterbury and to abstain from meeting Anglicans who do, and affirm the Jerusalem Declaration. Now, that is a bit much if you ask me. Look, as a traditional, missional, evangelical Anglican committed to biblical authority, the prayer book, the Anglican way of doing the church, I am generally pro-GAFCON. But there are features here that I do find deeply disturbing. For a start, defining membership in the Anglican Communion by who you separate from, that's not indicative of a healthy ecclesiology. I mean, this reminds me of the doctrine of 2 degrees of separation in some American fundamentalist churches. It's not enough just to separate from the liberals. You've got to separate from people who are friends with liberals. I mean, it reminds me of that. And this seems to be a very sectarian rather than Catholic approach to what constitutes the church. It seems to be insular rather than missional, and it defines holiness by separation rather than by consecration and conduct. Now, I can understand the requirement to affirm the 39 Articles, the Lambeth Resolution, number 110, the prayer book, and the Jerusalem Declaration, but I'm a little bit concerned and confused by the demand that in order to be Anglican, you have to cut off relationships with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and you cannot associate, formally or informally, with Anglicans who are in communion with the See of Canterbury. I can tell you now that those demands will be problematic and divisive within some GAFCON provinces or within some dioceses or some GAFCON sympathetic churches. The GAFCON exhortation is, in effect, pick a side and burn your bridges. But many conservative Anglicans will not be willing to do that, at least not yet. And let me give you an example as to why we may not want to do that. In Australia, in my own Diocese of Melbourne, we've recently appointed Bishop Rick Thorpe as the next Archbishop of Melbourne. With his appointment, it now means that the majority of Anglican bishops in Australia will be evangelical or evangelical-esque. In other words, it means that the House of Bishops in the Australian Anglican province will have a thin majority of evangelical or evangelical-esque bishops. If that is the case, then why leave? I mean, the House of Laity and the House of Clergy are already majority evangelical. Now the House of Bishops is going to have a razor-thin evangelical majority, so why leave? Why leave? Evangelicals are now in the ascendancy in the Anglican province of Australia. So for me, that it makes no sense. Furthermore, history tells us that when a denomination splits then continue amongst those who leave. Now, again, GAFCON is not saying they've left. They've said they've taken over. They're now asserting their authority as the numerically superior group of Anglican provinces and dioceses and people. But when the conservatives left the Episcopal Church in America in the early 90s, they did then fragment and divide amongst themselves in numerous ways. It was chaotic, it was difficult, it was painful, and even to this day, ACNA is still unhealthily divided over the topic of women's ordination. So my concern is that with GAFCON constituting themselves, reordering themselves as a new Anglican body, that there may be further ruptures and divisions between provinces and dioceses over ordaining women to holy orders. Now, I know that some people within GAFCON, I think, would like for GAFCON to take a hard line on women's ordination, but I also know there's lots of people within GAFCON who believe this is something we need to allow dioceses and provinces to disagree on, because even within GAFCON there's different views of women's ordination. But this could be a particular trigger point for future divisions within GAFCON. And this is what I'm concerned about. Historically, when there is a split or a division within a denomination, those divisions then continue and multiply. And I'm worried that that may happen within GAFCON. So let me come to a conclusion of my final thoughts. When I woke up this morning, I believed I was Anglican. Suddenly, now late into the night, I am not so sure. Now, I'm speaking of Anglican politics here. My theology and my ecclesiology are very Anglican. The church I attend is Anglican. But who recognizes me as Anglican, and on what basis am I Anglican? That is a complicated matter. I guess we'll find out in the coming weeks and months who is Anglican and who is not, and who's telling the story. But my friends, do pray for the Anglican Communion, and I would urge you all to pray over the words of Romans 14:19, where Paul says, "Let us pursue the things that make for peace and mutual encouragement." Amen. May that be the case. I'm Mike Bird, giving you a little bit of a rant on Anglican matters. Feel free to leave me a comment or a question. I'll be sure to answer. But do remember, I'm not answering any questions on behalf of any official Anglican body. I'm simply an Anglican priest offering my own reflections and a degree of lament about the fractures within our Anglican communion. Otherwise, God's blessing to all you, especially to those who belong to the household of faith.